What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm here to bring you the Season 5, Episode 3 review of Samurai Jack entitled XCIV, which is Roman numerals for the number 94. Just quickly, I wonder what those Roman numerals mean, because it's an odd numbering sequence. The first episode in the series, or the first episode in Season 5 was, I believe, 92, which is an odd number to start with. So I just wonder what those Roman numerals actually symbolize or actually mean. Besides that, just very briefly, got to talk to you about the upload schedule. I've just been unbelievably sick, so it just was not within my power to upload. However, I have seen my gastroenterologist. He has prescribed me some medication that is now doing the trick, that is now, thank goodness, working for me. And so my sickness should basically be under control for the foreseeable future. And plus, it wasn't that bad since we didn't get an episode of Samurai Jack last week. Well, you know what I mean. On April Fool's Day, basically, we didn't get an episode of Samurai Jack, so it wasn't that bad that I haven't uploaded in a couple of weeks. But given the fact that I'm feeling much better now, I've got my sickness under control, I should be uploading on a more regular basis. And this is the episode 3 review of Samurai Jack. The episode 4 review of Samurai Jack should be out within the next couple of days. So, I've already watched half of it, and I've already jotted down some notes and some thoughts. So the season 4 episode review will be forthcoming pretty quickly. Also, another preliminary thing. I just keep getting spoiled on these episodes, man. The people who are uploading clips of Samurai Jack to YouTube are spoiling the hell out of me, but since the cat's already out of the bag with respect to Samurai Jack now killing people, the spoilers aren't that bad, but it still kind of sucks. With that being said, let's jump into this episode review more thoroughly. So the first scene we get in this episode is the river scene. In literature, water generally symbolizes purification. It can also be a catalyst for moral transformation and rebirth. And one of the best known examples of this is the baptism in Christianity. The baptism in Christianity is a rite of passage, but it's also a rite of rebirth, and it uses water as a symbol for moral and spiritual purification. However, during this river scene with Jack, when he's bleeding, he's in the river, he's in the water, we also get some mixed symbolism here. On the banks of the river, we see that there are trees on the banks of the river. But those trees are either dead or they're dying. And in literature, trees can symbolize multiple things. Young trees symbolize new life, which is consonant with the symbolism of the water in terms of symbolism of rebirth and moral and spiritual purity and transformation. Robust trees, however, symbolize the prime of life. They are the full-on symbol of the robustness and the prime of life. However, dying trees or dead trees symbolize death. They symbolize that life is passing on, that it's going away. And so, like I said, there is an incongruity here with respect to the symbolism. On one hand, the water symbolizes rebirth, new life, spiritual and moral purification and transformation. But on the other hand, the dead and dying trees on the banks of that river symbolize death. So taken together, those two symbols, those two mismatched symbols, represent a sort of dying for Samurai Jack, but also the possibilities for his rebirth. But the question obviously is, what will Samurai Jack be reborn as? What moral transformation does this symbolism presage? This symbolism of death on the one hand and rebirth and moral transformation on the other hand. So in literature, this rhetorical device of juxtaposing opposing concepts and opposing symbols is known as antithesis. Like I said, the water symbolizes rebirth, transformation, purification, but the dead and dying trees on the banks of the river symbolize dying and death. But it doesn't just symbolize death, it symbolizes death on multiple levels for Samurai Jack. Of course, it's about the possibility of his physical death. So in one sense, he's in a state of flux. He could live or he could die. But it's also about Samurai Jack's psychological death as well. Because remember, he's essentially going insane through his guilt and shame that's driving him to hallucinate, that's driving him to basically be broken down psychologically and emotionally. But also the fact that he has killed one of the daughters of Aku also symbolizes death on the level of the death of his moral innocence. And so taken together, this antithesis, the juxtaposing of these concepts, these opposing concepts of life and death, is utilized to explore all the ways that Samurai Jack is dying and all the ways that he might be reborn through this spiritual and moral transformation that the water symbolizes. And so basically, Jack is at a proverbial fork in the road. And this connects to the fork in the road from the last episode as well, when you saw Jack, who was basically a lone wolf. He's on a path on his motorcycle. He comes to a fork in the road. He goes down one path and is set upon by his enemies. And this also connects to the parallelism and the metaphor of the wolf, because it was the same for the wolf. The wolf came to a fork in the road, took one path, and was set upon by his enemies and almost killed as well. And so there's a connection here between the metaphorical fork in the road and the literal fork in the road in the last episode, and now the fork in the road for the possibilities of Jack's death and the possibilities of his rebirth. So let's talk about that parallelism between Jack and the wolf a little bit more. So like I said, the parallelism of the last episode returns in the form of the wolf in this episode, and specifically when Jack and the wolf are in the cave together. So like Jack, the wolf is on the verge of death. And so again, we get this juxtaposition of opposing concepts of life and death and the possibilities for rebirth after a metaphorical kind of death. So again, there's that proverbial fork in the road. So last week, I talked about how the parallelism of the wolf was a metaphor for Jack, and specifically a metaphor for Jack's diminishing humanity. This week, however, the parallelism lends itself to a new metaphoric interpretation. So both Jack and the wolf are healed and reborn through their reciprocal relationship. So it's their shared trauma becomes the foundation for new possibilities of healing. And in the case of Samurai Jack, this healing takes the form of moral self-reflection. And for those of you who watched the live stream that I did with Otaku Assemble this past Saturday, that moral reflection takes the form of Bushido, as Otaku Assemble put it. So let's talk about the new possibilities for Jack's moral transformation through his self-reflection. And this takes the form of the flashback. So Jack's father, there's a flashback that Jack has to his father when he was younger and he was in Japan. So Jack's father had to kill people in order to defend himself. And one of the things that Jack's father says to a young samurai Jack is, he says, the actions you take and the decisions you make are a reflection of who you are. You cannot hide from yourself. And this was very simple, yet very, very profound. Your moral decisions will always reveal who you are. And this act of self-revelation leads to a sort of self-understanding. And it's that self-understanding, that moral self-understanding, that is the basis of your moral identity and your moral integrity. And this flashback and this idea of moral self-reflection and moral self-understanding and how those things are linked to your moral identity and your moral integrity is very, very important for this episode. And the reason why it's so important is because it links morality and violence and questions of life and death together in a very profound way. So before, in my first episode review, I talked about how I was a little reticent to see Samurai Jack take such a dark and edgy turn because I wasn't sure where they were going philosophically and literarily with this motif of dark and edgy. But here, as I've been saying, I think it fits very well, and here's why. Depictions of extreme violence, and in this case, we're talking about extreme violence here because Jack has to defend himself from the daughters of Aku in a very, very violent way. Depictions of extreme violence without death are morally questionable. And the reason why I say it's at least morally questionable is because to fail to fully explore the moral implications of death as a result of violence is an evasion. It's an evasion from both a moral standpoint and from both a literary standpoint. And it's not that I think that death is necessary for narrative plausibility, although there is that. If you have depictions of extreme violence without death, that does, I think, take away from the plausibility of the narrative. So there is that, but it's more than that. And my point is this: you cannot fully appreciate the moral gravity of an act of violence without taking that act of violence to its logical conclusion. And the logical conclusion of extreme violence is death. And that's what makes Samurai Jack's father's words so powerful. If you're going to believe in something, and if those beliefs bring you into not just conflict with others, but violent conflict, and if that conflict entails violence, then you should fully explore the moral implications of that violence. And that exploration must also include some reference to death, because death is the logical conclusion of extreme violence. At some point, all of us will have conflicts with others over what we believe. And if our beliefs are genuine, then you cannot hide from defending those beliefs. And sometimes it's necessary to use violence and even death in defense of those beliefs as a way to defend those beliefs, even if that defense requires violence and death, you must be fully prepared to fully explore the moral implications of using violence and death as a necessary way to defend your beliefs. And so this episode for me was all about how death and morality and violence in defense of one's beliefs are inextricably linked together. And this connects to what one of the daughters of Aku states when she says that death is failure. In other words, the heart of the conflict here, the heart of Samurai Jack's moral introspection and moral self-reflection is precisely linked to the question of violence and death, and how violence and death are necessary as a means to defend one's beliefs when one's beliefs put one in direct conflict with other people. And like I said, this happens for Samurai Jack, but it also happens for the daughters of Aku when the daughters of Aku state that, when one of the daughters of Aku states that death is failure. And this raises an interesting question about the conflict or the different ways that, or the opposing ways that Samurai Jack views violence and death, and the ways that the daughter of Aku views violence and death. So on one hand, Samurai Jack is using his understanding of violence and death as a means of spiritual and moral transformation. But on the other hand, the daughters of Aku are using death and violence as a way of just pure force and pure domination, and in some ways pure evil, which is how Aku uses violence and death. And so we get a very, very stark contrast here between the way Samurai Jack views violence and death and the ways the daughters of Aku view violence and death. And so, like I said, this raises a question based on the statement of one of the daughters of Aku. When she says that death is failure, we know that intuitively this is not true. That death does not necessarily mean failure. First of all, there are better and worse ways to die, right? Just in the same way that there are better ideas and worse ideas, there are better and worse ways to die. So if you die in defense of wrong beliefs, then in some sense you died a worse death than if you've died in defense of good ideas and good beliefs. And not only that, so there's the first part where there are better and worse ways to die. But the second part of that is sometimes a type of death is necessary for rebirth. And we see that in the symbolism of Samurai Jack, and in the symbolism of the water and the dead and dying trees. Sometimes dying is good. And sometimes dying can lead you to new possibilities of living and new possibilities of rebirth. So death isn't necessarily failure at all. And this episode explores the moral implications of death in multiple ways, and the ways in which death can be used as a means of spiritual and moral transformation and moral and spiritual rebirth. And we get this from, like I said, Samurai Jack's perspective, and we get this from the perspective of the daughters of Aku. So just to give you a summary of what's going on in this episode. So, and the philosophical and moral underpinnings that led up to what we see in this episode. So, in the last episode, we got the parallelism of Jack and the wolf, and how that parallelism was used to symbolize the diminishing humanity of Samurai Jack. In this episode, we got a more thorough explication of all the ways that Samurai Jack has died, and the possibilities for his death and rebirth. So we get the antithesis of life and death, and then at the end, through the reciprocal relationship between Jack and the wolf, we get his moral transformation, his moral introspection, and his spiritual and moral rebirth. And then we get how this connects to the stark contrast between both Jack and the daughters of Aku and their differing conceptions of life and death. So overall, the first couple of episodes have just been excellent. I mean, just excellent in what we've got. The philosophical and the symbolic setup of the first two episodes come to full fruition in episode 3 of this season of Samurai Jack. And it's just been awesome to watch and to analyze this. It's just really, really amazing how they set this up. We get like I said, the parallelism of Jack and the wolf, and how that is a metaphor for Jack's diminishing humanity, and how that diminishing humanity brings Jack to the brink of death, and how exploring Jack's death on multiple levels brings him to possibilities of rebirth and renewal and moral transformation. And I want to end this episode review by again talking about something that was brought up in last week's episode, which is this rhetorical device of dramatic irony, and why it's so important, because of how it ties everything together philosophically and literarily. So like I said before, dramatic irony is a rhetorical device where the audience or some characters in a narrative have information that another character in the narrative does not possess. So in other words, the audience knows something that a character in the narrative does not know, and this information is generally important for the plot or how the narrative plays out. And it's important, again, it's extremely important that Jack kills the daughters of Aku without ever knowing that they didn't have a choice in this matter. And I'll bring this up in my next episode review. Like I said, I've already started watching it, and so I'll link this to my next episode review. But what's important here is that from an objective standpoint, Jack's actions are in some sense morally objectionable. Yes, of course, they're understandable. He has to defend himself. At some point, he has to defeat Aku, and his moral integrity and moral identity demands that he stops the daughters of Aku, and as a result also stop Aku himself. And yet the deaths of the daughters is a moral tragedy, because on some level the audience knows that they were coerced into this. They are child soldiers. Their moral agency has been compromised insofar as they have been coerced into doing this. And therefore, it is morally questionable for Jack to kill the daughters of Aku, precisely because the reasons why he has to kill them is the fact that they've been coerced into this. And so this moral ambiguity will get explored further, like I said, in my next episode review. But this was a great way to end this episode, by bringing us back to the dramatic irony that's being used here, because it forces the viewer to view Jack's actions, at least from a moral standpoint, in a way that Samurai Jack himself cannot view his actions, because he simply doesn't have access to all the morally relevant information, which is that the daughters of Aku have been coerced into this course of action, into trying to kill him. So, like I said, another great episode of Samurai Jack. You really just cannot praise the writing of this series enough. And as I alluded to before, if the writing of this series continues to be this great, continues to be this excellent, then Samurai Jack might be starting to make some claims for being one of the greatest cartoons of all time. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.